You guys having any kind of issues, marital issues, or
We're going through separation.
you are? Did you guys file it yet or anything, or just talking about it?
No, we're gonna sell the house and do a separation.
And how's that going?
And it's going
Civil for the most
civil,
part, or?
yeah.
Are you going through any marital issues?
We're separated.
She didn't tell me that. She didn't tell me.
Have you filed yet?
No, we're still trying to figure out what we're doing with the house.
How's that going so far? Civil?
Yeah, well, civil.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. In this episode we will look at a few things the Lifetime movie got right. If you'd prefer a quick read, there's a blog post with points bulleted and images all there, which you can basically probably get the full treatment in maybe 1 to 2 minutes rather than listening to this video. So if you'd prefer to do that, head to crimerocket.com and visit the post 13 Things Right with the Chris Watts Lifetime movie. If you can't find that post, you can go to just crimerocket.com, scroll down, and you'll find it under the Crime News Updated Daily section. Otherwise, you can search for the post in the search bar, or you can go, if you scroll down the right-hand column, it eventually shows the latest posts. That's another way to just see what is current on crimerocket.com. For the rest, especially those new to this channel, if you're interested in true crime analysis, also if you're interested in reading about true crime, I'm a full-time true crime author. I've written books about the Chris Watts case, about the Ramsey case, Madeleine McCann, Casey Anthony, Scott Peterson, Jodi Arias, O.J. Simpson, West Memphis 3, Oscar Pistorius, Henry Van Breda, and Amanda Knox. If you're interested in any of those cases, I talk about them on this channel, also on Patreon, and the blog sites crimerocket.com and crimerocket2.com have got a lot of archives of analysis, also links to the books and so on. If you prefer to get the sort of more casual discussion about it, then you might want to subscribe to this channel. If you do, please like, share, and leave a comment, and let's get started. So the first thing I want to highlight, and I think one of the things that stood out to me the most in the Lifetime movie was this little scene, which seemed almost like a throwaway scene, I guess, on the face of it, but it's actually singularly important. The scene where Officer Coonrod is sort of confronting Watts and asking him somewhat discreetly, were there any marital issues? And in the original body cam footage, you have this really extraordinary moment that is sort of dramatized just through reality. So obviously you don't have cameras or makeup or actors or anything like that. And I remember when I researched this, just finding it extraordinary, just the symbolism in the actual fabric of reality. Because what happens is, at one moment, you see quite a ordinary shot of the house from Coonrod's body cam, and you see Nicholas Atkinson sort of in the picture. He's sort of leaning over the side of the stairway railing. So it's basically these three men in the image. And then Nicholas sort of exits the scene. He goes down the stairs, and then basically Watts and Coonrod are left together. It's just them. Nicole isn't around, and with Nicholas sort of not there, there's a sort of a moment of privacy that the officer can have with Watts, and he sort of asks him in a fairly casual way, but also in a kind of a sensitive way, was there any marital issues with you guys? And you can kind of see Watts walk towards or sort of step in the direction of Coonrod, because he doesn't really want to talk about it. He doesn't want Nicholas to hear it. He doesn't want Nicole to hear it. And so he sort of mutters a response quite softly. And there's a bit of a difference here between what he says and what is dramatized in the Lifetime movie. But what is so powerful to me in the actual footage is it's quite a dark moment that's recorded here. You sort of see Watts in kind of grey. He's standing in front of like a dark doorway, and everything kind of behind him is sort of grey and sort of dark and shadowy. You can't quite even make out Watts's face. You sort of, although you can, but it's sort of silhouetted in a way, just because of the low light. And then far to the right is the sort of bright sunshine. It's so bright that it's almost like white hot, coming through the upper windows above the front door and the lounge. And so on the one side you have this darkness and the shadowiness, and as I say, this sort of dark entrance. I think it's to the laundry room, and it's black behind him. It's a sort of black doorway that it looks like he's just stepped out of. And then, as I say, over his shoulder is this almost scalding white light, which is almost like the light of truth, the light of illumination, which is sort of touching his right shoulder. But it's also, I think, hinting at, just in my mind, it's hinting at what all of this was about. It's Watts is trying to be somewhere else. There's some white hot flame that has drawn him almost like a moth towards it. And I found that quite powerful. I found that the whole scene in the body cam really kind of a powerful scene. So I was glad that Lifetime caught it and dramatized it, and very glad that that whole thing about, so you are getting separated, is it civil? Because that's kind of the question one wants to know with any divorce. Any kind of breakup, you want to know, is it done in an adult, mature way, or is it done with grinding of teeth, with childish animosity? Is it civilized or isn't it? And Watts was sort of terrified, I think, that it wasn't going to be. And you might say, did he have good reason for that or not? But the point is, whether whatever you feel about it and however you would conduct a divorce or a breakup, Chris Watts was terrified that it was going to be, I guess, uncivilized is the word. And so when the officer actually asks him, was it civil? Watts is sort of struggling for the word. And then when the guy says civil, Watts sort of chuckles in kind of a self-deprecating way. And I just also thought that was such an authentic moment, not deliberately, but sort of accidentally. And so it's still interesting how the dramatization gets subtle aspects wrong. It's fascinating how, you've got the audio, you've got the video, you've got everything you need to dramatize it, and yet the Lifetime folks still don't get it right. And you might say, well, it's not necessary to get the nuances right, but it is. In true crime, people have died, and it's these subtleties that really give away what is true and what's not true of certain people. And there's such small little things that when an actor just glosses over them, he gets the personality and identity wrong, which I feel this actor did do. I do think it's interesting how he portrayed Chris Watts. His interpretation of Chris Watts was quite a cool, charming, assertive, selfish guy. And I think that is the impression people have of Chris Watts. And I don't think that is who Chris Watts is. I think Chris Watts is trying to portray himself that way as well. I think Chris Watts is trying to, especially with Coda and Lee in the interrogation cubicle, I think he was trying to come across normal, talkative, sort of assertive. Him saying that he had an argument with Shanann that morning, or not an argument, a conversation, was him trying to assert the fact that he's someone who would have a conversation with his wife about something that mattered to him. But the real Chris Watts wouldn't. And that's a subtle aspect that I think a lot of people have missed. And that subtlety is expressed where the fictional Chris Watts, the actor, claims that the separation is more formalized and more established than it really was. Like where he says quite assertively, "we separated." And that is not either how Chris Watts expresses it, or he doesn't express it in that sort of clear verbal way. In other words, even when he speaks, he sort of stutters and he isn't, it's sort of more mumbly, whereas the actor is far more eloquent and clear in how he speaks. And one can imagine that. One can imagine actors are confident. Actors do need to be clear when they say something. It's important that the audience hear what they're saying. But Chris Watts wasn't that way. He wasn't clear. He wasn't assertive. You often couldn't really make out what he was saying, and you kind of get the same thing from his father. His father is a nightmare to try and transcribe. Absolute nightmare. But there's a little bit of subtlety in those little difficulties he has expressing himself. So he will struggle to answer, and then unfortunately in this case Coenraad actually answered for him, where law enforcement should really be trained to ask a question and wait for the answer. Let the other person struggle with the tension and the awkwardness and then sort of provide an answer. So another thing just to mention here is Nicole Atkinson isn't in the actual scene with Coenraad. In the dramatization, she sort of comes up from the side to say, no, they aren't getting in a separation. Shanann didn't say something to her about that. And that's not strictly accurate. So I'm not sure if it's fair to say that she was unaware that the couple had marital issues. She absolutely did know prior to this moment. She knew when they were in Arizona. So there definitely was an awareness there. But whether Nicole was absolutely aware that they were in a formal separation, that's true. I don't think that had been communicated to Nicole. In other words, Shanann may have said, there have been some problems with Chris. He's very distant, he's standoffish, but that didn't mean that they were actually separated. And this was probably Lifetime using a little bit of license to say a lot through a little, and that little bit isn't necessarily accurate, but the aspect it's pointing to is accurate. Okay, so we are 13 minutes into this analysis, and we've only just completed the first point, so we're going to move through the rest pretty quickly. So number 2, the thing that Lifetime got right was sex with Nicole Kessinger. Now, although everyone's aware of it and everyone seems to think they know this case inside out, it's clear the 5-week period Watts and Kessinger, where they were together, felt like a honeymoon for both of them. It's because of the spark and electricity of these encounters that Watts was largely desperate to keep the new relationship viable. And since Watts was somewhat inexperienced with the opposite sex, one can imagine the spell being cast over him being so much stronger as a result when he found himself in a position of a co-worker pursuing him. Number 3, Shanann on social media, but seen from the perspective of a third party. So what I mean by that is it's one thing to see Shanann on her own social media. So in other words, there was a time where you could go on her Facebook and you could see her talking into the camera, and what you would see is someone playing to the camera, someone happy, someone made up in a sense of, makeup and well dressed and smiling and happy and thriving and all that kind of thing. It's another thing when you have another camera in the room looking at this person who is sort of filming themselves. And one thing I kind of noticed when I just try to get these screen grabs just is how often in the dramatization of Shanann, she's got a phone in her hand. And I do think that's true to life. And I think it shocked the Westward reviewer, who I think he thought this was really being exaggerated, that Thrive was being sort of unfairly emphasized. But what is interesting is in the dramatization of Shanann, it's sort of always related to Thrive. You don't sort of see Shanann that much separated either from her phone or separated from Thrive. You don't sort of see her in a setting where it's sort of, I'm not saying not at all, I'm just saying not often, where it's her as a person with other people without trying to sell that scene or trying to monetize that moment, if you get what I'm saying. And I kind of appreciate in a sense what Shanann probably must have been going through, just because once you monetize something that's online, then it does change the way that you conduct yourself online. And I've done that with Patreon. I've got a Patreon channel, and because that's up, my YouTube channel isn't as casual and I wouldn't say sincere, but it's kind of geared towards setting up Patreon, if you know what I'm saying. In other words, there's a different thing going on when you're just on social media for that, but when there's money that's added to it, it sort of adds a kind of pressure and tension, and there's kind of an agenda going on. You're trying to sell something, I guess. And that just, I think, changes the overall pressure of all of those sort of moments where you are, trying to engage with your audience. There's pressure on it. There's also the incentive to go and look, has this been successful? Has my attempt to get people's attention to promote this particular thing, has it worked? Right? And it may seem sort of silly, but if your full-time income relies on it, then you have so much more incentive to try and get it right, and the pressure on you is so much greater. But one can legitimately then ask, what sort of life do you have beyond that, beyond selling yourself online? Number 4, Nutgate. It's not explicitly referred to, but there is a scene where Shanann mentions not wanting their children to sleep at the Watts home. Number 5, Dietergate. This scene is slightly more explicit than Nutgate. And by the way, Dietergate, if you want to know about it, you can do a search on my channel where I did a video on Dietergate, and also I think it's mentioned on crimerocket.com. But I think I came up with the name Dietergate just based on, I wanted it to sound silly, just as Nutgate kind of does sound silly. I wanted a memorable name, so I sort of took the scenario, which is that Nicole visited the Watts home and apparently saw Dieter, and because she likes dogs, sort of followed Dieter up the stairs and Kissinger then sort of got caught up in kind of a labyrinth where she was sort of looking inside the house and she noticed the photos of the Watts couple. And this kind of made her aware of what she was actually in and what he was in, and why would he want to leave this, and would he leave this? And it turned out that her suspicions were founded, very, very well founded, because he didn't know how to leave all of this, as she put it. He was, in a way, a prisoner in his own home, whether in terms of debt or other things, but nevertheless he was. And all of this happened, I think it was July the 4th, although I do know that they went there on 2 occasions. The important takeout, of course, from Nutgate and Detergate is that both of these conflagrations raised the pressure on Watts to find a solution to his marital dilemma. What Nutgate and Detergate also did was they communicated to Watts the kind of personalities that he was dealing with in terms of areas of conflict or kind of dissent, if that makes sense. So in other words, if Shanann wasn't happy about something, that's how she would respond. If Kissinger wasn't happy about something, that's how she would respond. And so that was communicated to Watts, and I think because he was an introverted guy, because he was socially awkward, not like slightly socially awkward, very socially awkward, he was very unsure how to deal with it and how to deal with these women. And so he took the very weak way out, which was to sort of hide whatever he was going to decide to do in terms of his confrontation of these problems. He was going to do it almost by not confronting it. In other words, by doing something about it, but in such a way that it would look like it had just resolved itself, if that makes sense. Number 6, Watts is depicted as not happily married. So the depiction in the Lifetime movie shows Watts and his wife at a restaurant, and they trying to decide on what to call their unborn son, and Watts sort of suggests calling the child, naming the child after himself. And I don't think this is necessarily true. It could be, but I don't necessarily think Watts would have necessarily wanted to name the child after himself. But let's say it is true. He sort of thought of naming a child Christopher or Eddie, and I think Eddie is supposed to be their version of Ronnie. And then Shanann makes kind of a strange remark where she says, well, I want him to have friends. I don't want to call him a name like your father's name. I want our child to be popular. Where's your father? In other words, she's sort of mocking his father's name, but kind of in a nice way. But obviously you can imagine Watts not responding to that in a very positive way. And Shanann then kind of just overrules him and says, well, we're going to call him Nico Lee. And so even on the second name, she sort of overrules him. And then in the dramatization, you can see Chris Watts appearing just, he doesn't say anything, but he doesn't look very happy about it. And then when they order, he is about to say something, and Shanann sort of orders on their behalf, both of their behalves, that they're going to have grilled chicken, I think. And then again, Chris Watts doesn't say anything, but you can see what they're trying to depict here is just that he's not completely happy with how things are going. And I'm not going to go into it too much, because I think a lot of people will say they were happily married and Chris Watts did what he did just because he's a strange person or he's a narcissist or something. In other words, there's absolutely no relationship between him committing murder and their marriage. That they're absolutely irrelevant. But I think if you've got any common sense, you'll say, obviously, if there was marital discord, and that is what the various officers were asking about, then that could have an impact on motive and on his involvement, and as we saw, it did. And one can argue, if you take the marital discord away, would these murders have happened? And by that I mean, if Chris Watts and Shanann were really getting along well and in love with each other, why would this crime have happened? Another way of looking at it is, if Kessinger wasn't in the picture at all, would this have happened? And I think the answer is no, but one's also got to look at the really bad financial situation they were in. Had that gotten a lot worse, would Chris have gone to dark places in his mind in that respect? And although I tend to instinctively say no, it's difficult to say with Chris Watts whether that possibility wasn't there. So that's certainly something to think about. And then there's another dramatization which is a bit simplistic, where Shanann and Watts are in bed together and they're interrupted by the children. And this just seems to be kind of a classic representation of things that can happen in a marriage, where you don't get quite as much sexual satisfaction as you might normally get or want to get when there aren't children in the thing. And it sort of just shows what sort of by him lying in bed by himself, I guess, unfulfilled. And both of these scenes to me seem to emphasize this idea of him as a narcissist. So he wants the child named after him. He wants to order what he wants. He wants sexual satisfaction in bed. And while I get that, I don't think any of those things are really sort of standout issues that make Watts different to any other man, to be honest. That's just how I see it. And then number 7, I thought it was absolutely right of the filmmakers not to dramatize the driveway, simply because it's so unknown and it's kind of where angels fear to tread. So on the one hand, whereas I'm very, very glad they depicted that scene with Coonrod, talking about, are you guys getting separated and is it civil? I thought that was a small little moment, but actually very important. So I'm glad they depicted that. And I'm also glad they did not depict the whole driveway thing, just because it's so indistinct, and probably if they had depicted it, it would have been just not correct. And I know there are a lot of people that would have wanted certain things depicted. They would have wanted lots of cars driving around. They would have wanted lots of people running around, not just Chris Watts, but like a whole host of people sort of running around. And also the children running around. So they would have kind of wanted this sort of frenetic activity of a bunch of people running in and out of the house and children running in and out of the house and all that. And so I give them props for not dramatizing it. On the other hand, it's for me too bad that they didn't dramatize it, because I think if they did, people would realize how dumb the whole thing is. Because if you dramatized it, you literally have got to put children running on the driveway, you've got to put Chris Watts on the driveway, and you've got to put your sort of selection, your top selection of accessories on the driveway as well. So if you just try and imagine it, you, the filmmaker, so let's imagine you, one of these people who believe in the whole conspiracy and accessory thing. Okay, now you're going to film this. Okay, so now get your cameras in position. Okay, so how many people do you need for this scene? Okay, so it's Chris Watts, and then is it one of his children? Okay, so that's another one. Is it the other child as well? Okay, so that's 3. Then maybe it's a woman, that's 4 people. Okay, and then maybe there's somebody else, that's 5. Was his father there? Okay, that's 6. I don't know. So however many you want, if maybe it's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. So now you want all these people to sort of have their moment on the driveway, but you also don't want them to be sort of on the driveway at the same time. So in other words, from the perspective of the surveillance camera, you don't want them sort of walking side by side or passing one another, or like if there's a child, holding the child in their arms, because you can imagine a child being distressed under these circumstances, and it's early in the morning, and they're not really wearing shoes or anything. So when you carry the child outside into the vehicle, but you can't depict any of that. So you've got to have all of these individuals one by one. So what you kind of, I guess how you're going to dramatize it is you see one person, but clearly now in your version, then you're going to see another person, then you're going to see another person, then you're going to see another person. So each one completely on their own, sort of doing something, but they're supposedly doing it all together. They just never do it. You just never see them at the same time. That's how actually absurd it is, this thing that we're talking about. One thing I've sort of had a interest in doing, just because I'm a photographer myself, just with my magazine journalism work and so on. I'm also just have an artistic aspect to me. My great grandfather's a famous artist. So I would just love to actually go to that driveway on the same day, August 13th, whether it's 2020, 2021, whatever, and simulate the exact same conditions and then see what happens when you do. And so although I give props to Lifetime for not showing it, just because I don't think it's true, and also the whole Lifetime movie is based on something that's not true. It's based on Chris Watts' first confession. It's also based on the second confession, which isn't true either. But as I say, the little aspects of it that are true. But it's the difference between knowing who these people really are and what's really happening, and other people who I guess don't know. And I think the difference between true crime rocket science and the rest is, you can take a fragment and turn it into whatever you want to turn it into. For example, in the O.J. Simpson case, saying if they don't fit, you must acquit. You can take like a fragment. In the John Benet Ramsey case, you can take the fact that there's a little bit of DNA that they can't account for. You can take a fragment and sort of turn that into your entire case. But what true crime rocket science does is the opposite. You take all the information and you put it together in a inviolable fabric. And this fabric is huge. It includes the psychology, the evidence, the timeline, witness testimony, just looking at things from every conceivable angle and sort of knitting it all together into a cohesive whole. And that is going to tell you what happened in a story. Not just the psychology of one person, but multiple psychologies and the dynamics playing into it, the motivations, the driving forces and all that. And it's through that mosaic that you're going to get an idea of what really happened. The opposite is taking one little fragment and dressing it up as something really titillating and exciting, but then it doesn't line up with anything else. When it comes to trying to line that up with something else, you just don't have any explanation. So, for example, in this case, you say, so if the children were alive, how is it a premeditated murder? In other words, if Chris Watts had the choice, if it's a premeditated murder, and in terms of a premeditated murder, he had the choice of committing the crime at home in a controlled situation, making sure there are no witnesses, making sure it's the way he wants it to happen, making sure that he's going to be able to cover it up and get away with it, right? That's the one choice in the premeditation. Or that he's just going to sort of go along with it and figure it out as it sort of happens. He's going to sort of take his children along for the ride, and he's not sure what he's going to do, but he'll figure it out. That's what I mean by that doesn't fit in with premeditation. And you're going to have to make a choice somewhere along the line. Is it premeditated or isn't it? And the evidence shows that it was premeditated. And now, because of this shadow thing, now you want to turn it into whatever you want to turn it into. But it doesn't actually match the evidence or the personality of this guy. And as I say, that's the difference between true crime rocket science and the rest. When I say the rest, I literally mean everybody. The Lifetime movie, the law enforcement apparently say that this is the version they believe. It's Chris Watts's version. It seems to be the police version, I guess. And it seems to be the version even the family believe. So it is literally, True Crime Rocket Science stands absolutely alone on this sort of version. And I think the majority of people following this case subscribe to the Chris Watts version and not the True Crime Rocket Science version, which I think is really, really interesting. You would think people who are critics of me and of this channel, you'd think if I wanted to sell books, wouldn't I just go with the popular version? Because that's what everyone believes. Wouldn't I just tell people what they wanted to believe? And that applies also to the narcissism as well. It's very easy to sell that, just to say, well, he was selfish, he did what he wanted, whatever. Wouldn't it be easier to sell books by just caving into the mainstream view, if that's what everyone thinks? Wouldn't it be harder to sort of say, no, I actually don't think that's right? And then you get a lot of people unhappy and a lot of people criticizing you, saying, well, you're not credible, you're not an expert. So why go that route? Well, because True Crime Rocket Science is dedicated to a scientific study of the truth, of psychology, of the forensics. Not only in this case, but in all the other cases. And when you start doing that, you start seeing the same patterns of deception and also the same patterns of reception by the crowd, where people, instead of looking at the facts, say, yeah, I think this is a pedophile abduction. I think the person who attacked JonBenet Ramsey is a pedophile. And what they're doing is they're taking on the defense PR version, And PR plays a really big role in true crime. And it's up to True Crime Rocket Science to dismantle these popular mainstream theories which simply aren't true. Okay, and so as you may have noticed, I've just highlighted the first 7 of the 13. I'm not going to be putting the rest on Crime Rocket, and I'm not going to be putting them on this channel. I'll be putting 8 to 13 on Patreon under the $2 tier. There's also a host of other content on Patreon at the moment, including analysis on the Killing of JonBenet podcast. There are also a couple of audiobooks that have been uploaded, narrated by me. But if you want the free version of the analysis, as I said, just head to crimerocket.com and you can get all the information without spending a penny. So head to crimerocket.com and I will see you guys next time.